Thank you everyone for joining us for Palestine Writes' first ever cultural spotlight. We're very excited about this initiative. So we decided in order to continue the momentum of the festival and all the excitement we got from it is to continue our mission to share Palestinian literature, art, storytelling, and continue to control our own narrative. So we're super excited to have Ibtisam Azem for our first ever cultural spotlight for the Book of Disappearance, which I actually ordered during the festival and got so excited while reading it. So I'm really thrilled to hear this conversation. And we're really also thrilled to be partnering with the Institute for Palestine Studies. And we have their very own Laura, who is the communications manager there, and she'll be moderating the discussion. So I'm gonna turn off my camera, take a step back, and I'm super excited to hear the awesome conversation that's gonna happen between Laura and Ibtisam.
All right, thank you so much, Aya, and thank you, Palestine Writes, for starting the Cultural Spotlight. We're thrilled to be co-hosting it with you. So my name is Laura Albast. I am the Communications Manager for the Institute for Palestine Studies, and I'm really honored to be able to interview Ibtisam Azem, who has written this incredible novel, The Book of Disappearance. Just to introduce her a little bit, she is a Palestinian novelist and journalist. She was born in northern Jaffa. She holds a master's degree in Islamic studies with minors in German and English literature. And she holds another master's degree in social work from New York University. She works as a senior correspondent covering the United Nations in New York City for the Arabic daily Al-Arabi Jadid. She's also co-editor at Jalaliya Ezine. She has published 2 novels in Arabic, Sariq al-Nawm, The Sleep Thief, and The Book of Disappearance, which is this one, Sifr al-Ikhtifa. It was translated into English by Sinan Antoun and published by Syracuse University Press in July 2019. It was chosen as the 2020 title for librarians and archivists with Palestine's International Reading Campaign, One Book, Many Communities. The English book was published in 2019, and the Arabic was in 2014. Now, to give a brief introduction of the book, for people who may have not had a chance to read it yet, all Palestinians living in Palestine disappear without a trace from one day to the next. What the Israelis in the book call a national crisis impacts all aspects of life in the country. Palestinians from the West Bank do not show up to work in the fields. Palestinians living in towns and cities in the interior vanish from hospitals, restaurants, and their homes. We do not know where they went, but we understand how vital they were to the basic function of the society. We follow the stories of Alaa, the Palestinian, and Ariel, the Israeli. Alaa's story appears from letters written to his deceased grandmother about Jaffa and his crisis of identity. Ariel is Alaa's friend and neighbor. In the beginning, he is fond of Alaa and questions, as a number of other Israelis, whether the Israeli army and forces had anything to do with the disappearance of Palestinians. But as we move through the book, and as he reads Alaa's letters to his grandmother, Ariel's view gradually shifts. He gradually champions this new society, which no longer has any Palestinians. Throughout the book, we see other snippets of life impacted by this disappearance. Israelis are furious to discover that prisoners have disappeared from their cells. Surgeons do not show up to operate, and buses never arrive. In the 48 hours after the disappearance, we see a frantic Israeli government casting blame, entering a state of emergency, and celebrating. And while Palestinian refugees attempt to return and cross the border, they seem to instantly disappear. As Ibtisam writes, it is as if Palestine is devouring its children. And on that note, I'm so happy to be able to ask you some questions about your work. And I would like to begin with a question about Alaa, who I think is the most moving character in the book. So Alaa is shown to be heavily a part of the Jewish community and the Jewish world. With Ariel, with leftists, he jokes about being the token Arab. Israelis find his stories about his Jaffan grandmother to be amusing. He seems generally to go along with it. Did you want your reader to feel empathy for this character or to be bothered by his mild acceptance of this tokenism? And to what extent are we Palestinians tokens or entertainment or the cause of choice for people looking to find meaning?
First, thank you so much for the great introduction. Let me start also by saying I'm really honored and happy to have this conversation with you. Thanks, Aya, and the whole team of Palestine Writes, and thanks for having me and picking this whole events with our conversation. So thanks again, Palestine Writes and Institute of Palestinian Studies. So let me start by saying, or Alaa, like all Palestinians is a minority in a settler colonial country, especially if we talk about Palestinian citizens of Israel. So being tokenized is always a possibility. Alaa is very often sarcastic, actually, and jokes about the tokenization. He's aware of it. He doesn't accept it, but he has to live with it, as many people, or to try to deal with it in one way or another. There's different ways he does it, as we said, sometimes also being sarcastic. You mentioned Israelis find his stories about his Jaffan grandmother to be amusing. To a certain degree, it's true, as long as he doesn't talk about actually the Nakba and what happened in 48. So when that happened, they don't want to hear about his grandmother. Her story is the story they deny and want to erase, because it disturbs their colonial narrative. It goes from, but there is a scene where he talks about he wish they would ask more. He wish they would want to know more. And that's the scene, but they don't do in reality. And that's the scene where he goes from Rothschild Boulevard and walks until he gets to the shore and the beaches of Jaffa. As for the other part of your question, regarding the reader. Okay, so maybe I will surprise you when I tell you that I don't think a lot about the reader until maybe the very end of my writing and when I'm editing. And I don't try to manipulate them, but if we look at some of the details, I will understand why people would think that in a way or another. In other words, you have, there are many characters and many voices in the novel, you're right. It's largely about Alaa and his grandmother. So we hear his voice and see his perspective, and readers will probably empathize with him. So it wasn't planned, but one of the reasons why this could also happen is the genre that was used within the novel to talk about Alaa, or Alaa, the genre where he writes diaries and memoirs, his chapters. These diaries and memoirs give the reader the possibility to go more into the inner life of the character, to know more about their feeling, about how they think and what's happening. So that one reason also. But the most important thing for these chapters, and why I chose also to have them separated from other chapters, why I chose the Palestinian when the memoirs are in separate chapters, because I wanted to have the Palestinian voice takes charge of his own narrative. So he tells his own story, and theoretically, no one can silence him or stop him or comment about it. So his so-called friend, Ariel, even when he reads these memoirs, Alaa is not there anymore to hear his comments.
Thank you for that. It's always wonderful to hear from the novelist on, the different perspectives that come out from readers, how they differ from the actual process of writing. I wanted to ask you about the genre of the book itself. So, it has a dystopic sort of big brother atmosphere. There are mechanical statements from the Israeli government about the situation. You have Israelis who they express regret for the disappearance of Palestinians, and blindly follow orders. And you have Israelis who celebrate and think this is the greatest thing that has ever happened to them. The Palestinians are gone. The Israelis turn on themselves and they start registering each other. In the book you write it, where they start to be monitoring each other, where everybody is at all times. How close to a dystopia is Palestine and Palestine Israel today when we hold up to the atmosphere that you have created in the book?
That's a really very interesting question. And if we take for a moment a step back, if you look, Israel's or like if we it is very close to the actual reality. So the actual reality is dystopian for sure. It fits the general definition of dystopian place. Everything I described in the novel exists in Israel. The disappearance and the events that follow allows me to put many things under a microscope. This is the reality of Israeli society and how it operates. And frankly, many other similar society, if we talk about this land and America, South Africa, so it's all goes in the same or similar direction. But I wanted to discuss the theme of disappearance and also in its different layers here. So yes, we have the literal disappearance, which you mentioned, and it's the main product of the theme. But there are other things as well. One theme that the novel tries to deal with is what happens to states and people whose identities are founded on a violent exclusion and denial of the other, the enemy. This includes also the racist denial that Palestinians exist as an identity. I mean, we know the very famous sentence of Golda Meir, who said there is nothing called Palestinian people or something like that. So also denying, very often Israelis talk about Palestinians as Arab Israelis, especially Palestinians in Israel. So this is also another way of denial. But also the disappearance has also another dimension that it retrieves or mirrors the disappearance that did happen in Palestine in 1948. If you think about the 750 Palestinians who were displaced and were forced to leave their country and became refugees all over the world, or also partly in their own land. So that's part of it. But also there is kind of, in a weird way, a relief for the victims or for the Palestinians when they disappear, because they one of a sudden they say, you know what, we are not engaging anymore. We are gone. That's it. So it has all these different layers and that go with what you were mentioning too.
Thank you so much, Ibtisam, for that. And there was another question that was more, relevant to Ariel and Alaa. They had so many conversations throughout, and we always see it throughout the novel, and they're always disagreeing about something. At one point in the novel, Ariel whines about Alaa. He says, Why all this thinking about the past? It's funny because Israelis say that Palestinians should forget the past, but the entire national narrative in Israel is built on the phrase "never forget," which references to the Holocaust. Can you discuss this hypocrisy? Do you think that fiction and literature is the best medium to show, these contradictions?
I mean, I think colonial narrative in general, and we see it in this country too, is built on denial of the erasure of the lands and people's history. Mahmoud Darwish famously wrote about how tyrants fear memoirs or memories. So for the colonizers, I think there is only their past and their story. Now, Palestinians and other colonized people, and I read I think a week ago, something, I think it was about this country, I can't remember where exactly, but the author made a very interesting point saying that actually people who are under colonialization, actually we are, when we talk about the past, we actually talking about the future. We want to talk about the past because we are engaged in imagining and trying to build a future of equality, a future of justice, a future of right of return, freedom. The past is always imagining and building the future. So the colonizer, on the other hand, when they are the ones actually who are not living the future, they are the ones who are living in the past, and they want the frozen past, the past where they got all these privileges. So when a Palestinian speak about the past, I'm actually, when I'm as a Palestinian speak about, I'm actually the past, I'm actually talking about the future, where I want to be. And I think fiction is one great way, absolutely, to enrich space to be able to do it, because and especially novels, because you can bring all this socio-economic, class issue, gender issue, and put the life of your characters in a broader context, and make historic events and political events more understandable from what does occupation mean for your daily life? What does colonialization? We talk about all these things, but literature and novel are actually the ones who do it the best. And of course, films and etc. But yeah.
No, I completely agree with you. I think books are the way to go. And I think it's what you said is extremely important. The past, when we talk about the past, we're talking about the future. We need to keep that in mind in all spheres and all of our work. I will remind the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A option in the bottom of the screen. We will be, asking all your questions to Ibtisam as we move forward. So I do want to move to something that I found interesting. So the novel was initially written in 2014 in Arabic. And in the book, you foreshadow normalization with several Gulf and North African countries. And this normalization took place only last year. One Israeli soldier says, we will be able to help a lot of Arab countries with our technologies. What gave you this premonition? How were you able to predict that?
I mean, first of all, there are other normalizations that took place. They were different with Egypt and with Jordan. But in general, in the past, before the latest wave, but the latest wave, I think, got a lot of reactions for many different reasons, given the fact that at least Egypt and Jordan, without giving excuses to that, but at least they have borders and whatever. I think that that's a huge topic to discuss and a very important topic. But in general, I think I never had growing up. I mean, being born and growing up in Palestine and living for a while in Jerusalem, and I never had this illusion about Arab regimes, not Arab people. That's totally different. And for me, it's not surprising, because at the end of the day, these dictators exploit and exploited the Palestinian issue for their own narrow political agenda. And those who can't treat their own people well, then they are not going to care about Palestine. That's as simple as that.
You're right. I want to move on to a little bit of a sensitive topic, but it's in the book, and I think it's important to address. And this is considered a taboo subject in many Arab communities, particularly in the context of your book. In a flashback to an Israeli operation, you depict a group of Israeli soldiers sexually assaulting both a Palestinian man and a Palestinian woman. It is an extremely horrifying scene. And while there have been depictions of sexual assault of Palestinians in literature recently, they are extremely rare. Why do you think this has been the case? And do you think that this is changing? And why did you make the choice to write this scene?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question that we need, and it's a very complicated one too. Let me try to put it first, to take a step back and try to put it in a broader context, and the context of the Palestinian body. Palestinian bodies, or Palestinian body, is a subject to violence, pain, and was, and still, a target to be controlled and violated in life and death. And that's very important, the issue of death too. You see this, the way Israel treats the corpse of Palestinians who has been killed by Israeli forces. They keep sometimes the bodies of the Palestinians for months. They don't allow sometimes the families to bury their children unless they do it at night. So there is this body issue is very, very important, but also Palestinians' bodies are also, you see it in checkpoints and prisons, and the control who is allowed to move where, etc. Rape, now going back to your subject, rape is a weapon used in wars. It was used in 1948, and as in many colonial occupation, etc. But we also, we live in a patriarchal society. So the issue, becomes a sensitive issue. And then always, how do you want to talk about it? And so the story of the rape is not, so there is another part of that story, and the way I wrote it, it's a very short story within the novel, one of these short chapters. But the woman who was raped and survived that rape stayed in Palestine, stayed in Jaffa, and was sitting all of her life daily outside her house and saying some things and telling her stories. But no one listened to her, including her family, meaning her Palestinian society, partly. Of course, no do Israelis listen to her too. They all think they were passing by. They all think that she's just crazy. But the issue with Dayan, the perpetrator, that he stayed silent all these years, and that's a very important issue. The story is about also the silence that continues even after the woman disappears. Dayan stays silent, The silent is in a way continuation of this violence and that rape. And after she disappeared, what does he do? He blames her. The story, he blames her that she disappeared, and after 70 years, he wasn't even able to apologize for her, kind of. This is like one of the thoughts. So it's about kind of a mirror for the perpetrators and silent, and their silent bystanders who don't do anything. And it's and as you said, it's a very complicated subject. We need to talk about it. There is people who talked about it historically, books, research, but it's something this sexual violence is not talking about as it's should be.
You're right. I do think we should talk about it. I also read a couple of Palestinian books recently that have mentioned these things, and it's a great analogy that you use. The Palestine and Palestinians, you know, their bodies are always violated in every way. Before I move on to the Q&A and ask you about your writing process as well, one of Alaa's lovers, Jumana, she expresses her frustration with life in Palestine. She was sick, you're right, she was sick and tired of both Arabs and Jews and of Palestine and all things Palestinians. She goes abroad and she never returns, and she calls her country a grave. To what extent do you think that Palestinians currently living in Israel, in Palestine, including you, feel that Palestine is a grave?
Well, there is, I think my feelings about my surrounding always changed. It is, we have to admit that the life of Palestinians in their own homeland is, it's just not easy. And it is absolutely human and normal to also be fed, I mean, that you can't stand anymore, this occupation, this colonialization, there's constant control, all this stuff. So, but this is one thing. It is a place where there's a lot of sacrifice. People sacrifice a lot. But if you look at the novel, there is a chapter with Alaa almost at the end, where he tries to reconcile or to look at his own homeland in a new way, and to retake this public space and live in Palestine despite the occupation and the colonialization, and seeing and trying to admire its beauty and seeing the resilience, the strong sides of being there. So it's the character evolve with time, and this is a normal thing that people go through. And I think when you are younger, you have all this more pressure from family and society and the political pressure. And with time, if things get better, you are able to understand a lot of things and put them in the broader context.
We have a question from the audience from Malini, and I really appreciate you asking this because I wanted to go back to Alaa and Ariel's relationship. The question is, could you talk about the relationship between Ariel and Alaa? It seems to her and to all readers as well that Ariel, despite being okay with the disappearance of Palestinians, he's almost obsessed with Alaa. He enters his house, he takes over his apartment. It's as if he cannot be away from Alaa. He even eventually takes Alaa's notebook and wants to create his own book out of Alaa's stories. Did you intend to suggest as well that Palestinians are part of the Israeli psyche and they are important in any way? So these two things, Alaa and Ariel's relationship and how Palestinians are vital to the society, in that society.
Yeah, no, that's an important question. I mean, for the first part, this relationship is a very complicated relationship because even when you assuming that you meet or you get to know some Israelis who are not liberal, but really different and real leftist, whatever that means. I mean, it's, but that relationship is actually never an equal relationship.
Yeah.
As a power relationship, you are always, as a Palestinian, going back, no matter who you are, no matter which socioeconomic situation you are living in, no matter where you live, you are always going back to one reality.
Mm-hmm.
You are being under colonized in your own land.
Yeah.
And you don't have control on any political things that's happening. You are working to change them. This is what Palestinians have been doing from one intifada to another, from one demonstration to another, for resistance, etc. Before that, I mean, so, but you have one Israeli system that being applied differently to different Palestinian groups.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's one apartheid state. And that no matter, and as long as you are on the land of Palestine, this relationship is always governed by that political reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to shift a little bit back to you as a novelist, as a writer. Can you take us through your writing process? Do you have any rituals, a specific time of day that you like to write in?
So it's different from where, I mean, if I take my first book, the Sarqnam Gharib Hifawi, which was published, I think, about 10 years ago or 11 years ago. Back then, I was still living in Germany, and I was working in a television station. I was working as a journalist, so I have a totally different, and I was part of a team. So my work was, I did a lot of evening shifts, and I was writing a lot at night. I'm a night person. But things changed now, given the nature of my work and being a correspondent and having to cover the UN, where you have constantly a lot of meetings, a lot of breaking news, etc. So now I am somebody who, believe it or not, I mean, a lot of people who know me don't believe that. I woke up really early, like in spring and summer. In the winter is more difficult. Around between 5 and 5:30, drinking coffee with my husband. Maybe we take a walk, but then I don't look at any social media. I don't check my emails, and I try just to do the writing until 9 or 9:30, 10, and then it's a storm of, as we all know, the new technology. I try not to, I'm active on Twitter, for example, for professional reasons as a journalist. But for example, I don't have Facebook as an app on my phone. I do go sometimes, and I have it still, but sometimes like 3-4 days go by without checking Facebook. I try, so that's like for the social media and all these things. But other things, I'm somebody who, living in New York before, but living in New York, I discovered walking. So part of writing is also a lot of walking, a lot of things that I can't really, where I feel stuck, I walk in my daily life in New York. Okay, before the pandemic, but now things a little bit changed. But at least an hour and a half. I walk to work. I come back. So it's, for me, walking has also this habit of thinking a lot about things. When I write, depends on which phase, but like with the Book of Disappearance, you have also to do a lot of reading, other readings from other genres or other fields. I listen a lot of music. I used to write fiction, sometimes go to cafes and listen, and the music I listen to depends on the character I'm working at.
Can you give us an example?
So with the Book of Disappearance, when I was writing Ariel's chapters, I was sometimes listening to some Zionist music, like Ashkenazi style, just to be in his world, assuming that probably these singers, they're not like, probably he'll be listening to that. When I was writing Alaa, I was listening more to Oud. But in general, I listen a lot to classical music. I mean, it is mixed, jazz. So this music is really very important part of my process. Sorry, I don't want to go too long about this answer, but I usually also have a lot of different drafts, and there's a different periods when writing, sometimes writing from the feeling and the inner world, etc. But then when I go to more advanced stages of writing, I am more of an editor of my own work. And of course, there is show it to my first reader, get feedback, think about it, all this stuff. So yeah.
Honestly, thank you so much for sharing your whole process. It's a beautiful process, you know. I think to hear, as you know, if there are writers in the audience as well, to sort of learn from you. We do have a question from the audience related to Jaffa. So if we can go back to the novel a little. Related to Jaffa in relation to the white city. So you mentioned the white city this whole time, evoking Jaffa's spectral relationship to Tel Aviv. There are a lot of layers of historical haunting by Alaa's grandmother's story, the Nakba, erasing names and places. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So part of choosing Tel Aviv has to do also with the relationship between Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and how Tel Aviv, although it was so-called built before 48, or at least part of it, there is this myth, Israeli myth, about Tel Aviv being the new, the modern, the different. It's not built on Palestinian ruins, which is not true, because it is built on part of Jaffa and also on Palestinian villages and their lands, etc. But if you look, I always find it really fascinating. Public spaces, I never paid attention. I always felt suffocating in some areas where Palestinian lives because of the ghettoization, because it's like ghettos in some areas. And I, as a child, and you know, when you grow up, you start thinking about your surrounding and why things look the way they look, and why Jaffa today is so marginalized, the Palestinians in Jaffa. You have I chose Jaffa not only for the personal connection with my grandmother, which helped me in writing, but because Jaffa was the most important city in Palestine before 48. It was the largest, economically, was very important, intellectually, culturally. So it was important to put this into perspective. An architect is something very important whenever you go, from Palestine now, wherever I go, any city in the world, I look at the world also in different eyes. I always ask myself about things I don't see because of my Palestinian experience. And I ask myself also about the meanings of things I see. So it was important also to have Alaa gradually building a new connection in a way that he is retaking this space this occupied, this colonialized space, and trying to have a new connection to it. So that was part of the whole idea. But if you read more, and I hope people will be encouraged to read more about the architect and the stone, and there are a lot of really very important books about this, and very interesting books on this regard. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And speaking about other books, are there any novelists that influence you, or writers that you read that you like?
Yeah, there are a lot. I mean, you know, as you mentioned, I did study. I mean, okay, I am a child of the Arab culture, so I am influenced also by a lot of Palestinian and Arab writers. From, of course, Habibi to Ghassan Kanafani. I think Ghassan Kanafani was really very influenced me a lot. But Hussein al-Barghouthi, he died in a very young, relatively young age, in his 50s, in cancer. And I wrote my thesis, the master thesis, about his book, Ad-Du'u al-Azraq. And it's a very beautiful novel, memoirs. I mean, it's, but also Sa'akunu Bayna al-Laws. And his articles about theories of how to write literature and how you should were very influential. Studying in Germany and studying German and English literature also influenced me a lot, especially one of the writers I really like, his name is Wolfgang Boschet. He died in a very young age, but his short stories are really very compact, intensive, and he writes about the war, but from a different, from the perspective of daily life. But I like theater a lot, and I like, of course, what comes in mind, Saad al-Ghannous, not only his plays, but also his theoretical writing and the way he engaged with international theater. But African-American writers, James Baldwin, many others, yeah, definitely. For now, I usually read also more than one book, which I'm not sure always if it's a good habit. So now I'm reading not literature, a very interesting book by Ismail Nashif. The title in Arabic is اللغة العربية في النظام الصهيوني قصة قناع استعماري. So it's a very interesting book that deals with how Arabic language is being used in Israel in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And I would like you to share something else more related to your work. What are you working on right now? Should we be expecting more beautiful stories, impactful stories?
So I have two projects, or let's say three, but two projects that hopefully this year, yes, you can expect a short story collection. I did write short stories, published them in different places, but I don't have a short story collection. So that will be my first story collection in Arabic. And I'm working on that really hard now to try to bring it out, hopefully in end of summer. And there is a novel project that I have been working at for 5 years. It's a very complicated or inspired by a story of a family in Jaffa. And it has to do with the connection between drugs and politics, and how the state used drugs to control Palestinians, especially in big cities like Jerusalem, like Jaffa, like Lud, Ramle. So that's the project, but it's although I did there a lot of interviews, and I was lucky to have access to people I never thought I will, but still I need to do then a lot of reading and archive to catch more that subject from a very different perspective, because it's a very complicated issue. So let's see, but that's unfortunately going to take a little bit time, because I have two jobs, the writing and the journalist. If I have a bestseller one day, I don't have.
We are super excited. I'm sure everyone in the audience as well is super excited to read what you have for us. And on that, we do have some writers in the audience, and they are asking, what tips do you have to aspiring Palestinian writers, especially when it comes to publishing internationally?
Internationally, they mean in English or in other foreign languages?
I think in English. Let's go with that.
I mean, to be honest, I will talk about my own experience. I think the most important thing, I personally prefer to write in Arabic. I think this is the language I can express myself as a creative self, the creative writing best in Arabic. And I think it's very important to write in a language that you can. Of course, you never master any language, really. It's always a struggle, and especially with but there is different. It is good to have at least your the tools that you are using, that you are controlling. I would say reading is really important, and reading really very different things. But I personally think one shouldn't think too much about how people, but of course it's everyone and their, of course we care about how people will receive our work. Don't get me wrong, but I think with time you get really more selective and and it is more important that when you write to be not only authentic, but to be true to yourself, to oneself, and to not to rush to publish. And if you are lucky and get published in other languages, that's great. But there are also a lot of great writers who were not translated. So being translated is a great, but that shouldn't be what people should care about.
Thank you for that very useful advice, Ibtisam. If I may ask, would you be willing to read an excerpt for us as we end this cultural spotlight?
Sure. So I will read from chapter 3, Alaa, one of the short paragraphs where he talks about the issue of memory, since we talked about the memory, and I practiced that part, so I can read it better. Okay, so I'm mad at you. Your memory, which is engraved in my mind, has all these holes in it. Am I not remembering all that you told me, or was it incomprehensible? I was very young when I started listening to your stories. Later, when I turned to them for help, I discovered these holes. I started to ask you about them. The more I asked, the more you got mixed up. Or maybe I did. How would things not get mixed up? I was certain that there was another city on top of the one we live in, dawning it. I was certain that your city, the one you kept talking about, which has the same name, has nothing to do with my city. It resembles it a great deal, the names, orange groves. Al-Hamra Cinema, Apollo Weddings, Prophet Rubin's Feast, Iskandar Awad Street, Al-Nuzha Street, Al-Sa'a Square, etc. Where do all these names come from? You would be walking and you start mentioning other names too. Names not written on signs. I had to learn to see what you were seeing. And all these people. I got to know all their problems and how they were forced to leave Jaffa. I know all the boring and at a time interesting details about their lives. I know all the jokes they used to tell. All this without having even met a single one of them. I'm probably never will. Your Jaffa resembles mine, but it's not the same. Two cities impersonating each other. You carved your names in my city. So I feel like I am a returnee from history, always tired, roaming my own life like a ghost. Yes, I am a ghost who lives in your city. You too are a ghost living in my city, and we call both cities Jaffa.